I have one story in this podcast that I think it's going to blow you away. And I've said before on this podcast over and over, there's no way for me to verify that any story I've ever done is true. There's no way I could verify it. There's no way that you know if it's true. These are emails that people send me, and we just have to trust that they're telling the truth. But I have no way to verify it. And you can't verify it either. I've had a lot of people say, oh, that story wasn't true. Well, you don't know that. There's no way you can know that. But this story was so good, I'm putting it in a podcast by itself. Again, I think it's going to blow your weave off. You might spit your dentures out in your lap. But if you do, just pick them up, stick them back in your mouth. You'll be all right. All right, here we go. My grandfather's brother, my great uncle, saved a clan of Sasquatch by killing a rogue male. This is his story. I never met my uncle. I may have seen him, but I was too young to remember him. My grandfather only saw him twice after they all left home. Granddaddy went into the timber business, and his brother left the next year to go south to Texas. He had heard there was good work in the oil fields, and I suppose he was after an adventure. That is the way people did in those days. And if a child left the house and moved across the country, they might not see their families again, ever. These two men and the rest of their brothers and sisters left home around the time of the Depression, or sometime in the 1930s. Out of 8 children, only one stayed home to live on the family farm and help with the small operation. The other 7 went their own way. Uncle John came home once 8 years after he left. He stayed with his mother and father for a month, and then he took a bus back to Texas. The Second World War broke out. He joined the military, and after the war, he went straight back to Texas to resume his job in the oil fields. My uncle stayed gone another 3 decades until one day a car pulled in front of the home place, and he was back. He had been injured doing whatever he was doing, and at his age and with no wife or children, he needed a place to stay while he recovered. It was a back injury because Granddaddy told me that his brother probably walked crooked the rest of his life. My uncle stayed with my grandparents for several months until he was well enough to leave and do office work for the company he worked for. My granddaddy had left the timber business and built a house on the family land. His parents, my great-grandparents, had passed on. There was one brother left to take care of the farm, and he was my grandfather's twin, and that would be Granddaddy's job for the rest of his life. For the first 3 months, Uncle John would not leave the house. He was in enough pain just from the drive back to Tennessee that he would just sit on the back porch in a rocking chair my grandmother had bought for him, and it was more comfortable than any chair they had. John would sit and rock in that chair and read or whittle on a stick of wood all day. He'd eat, and then he'd go to his bedroom. My grandmother knew he was bored out of his mind, and she knew if there was any way he would be out helping his brothers with the farm work. She saw the guilt and shame in his face every day, but he never said anything. He just sat on that porch rocking and healing. Sometime around the first week of that 4th month, he got up and walked off the porch. My grandmother watched him from the big window. John walked out under the canopy of maple trees that shaded the back porch, and she watched him begin to stretch his back. The first day, she said he couldn't hardly reach his knees, bending over, but by the week's end, he was touching his toes. He did a little walking, too. He was trying to build his strength back. There was a conversation at the supper table about him starting to help around the farm, but my grandfather refused to allow him to do any of the heavy work because he was afraid that he would aggravate his back. To meet Uncle John halfway, my grandfather gave him an axe, a saw, and a Kaiser blade and put him to work clearing the edge of a field not far from the barn. The summer had been hot and they had had a lot of rain, and my grandfather had not had time to keep up with it. Uncle John was happy to have something to do, and he took to that field the next morning. He would make it until around dinner, which is what we call lunch nowadays, and he would come back and eat and quit for the day because he was still having problems with his back. But after 2 weeks, he was working full days. My grandmother was glad to see him feeling like a man again. One evening, while they ate, a discussion started that alarmed my grandmother. Uncle John started asking questions about strange animals in the woods behind the barn. There were shadows that he could see in the timber when the sun was right, and at first he thought he was seeing things, but every day they moved in those woods. Uncle John told my grandparents that he thought these animals were watching him work. My grandfather had seen them too, but the animals had never bothered him, and he knew if he told anyone about it, they would say that he was crazy. But now that Uncle John was talking about it, he felt free to discuss it, and this is how the truth came to my grandmother. She had never seen anything like the animals they were talking about, but she didn't spend any time on the land. The kitchen and the house and the children had been her responsibility. She told me shortly before she died that she had never seen her husband so relieved to tell her anything, and that he had wanted to tell her, but like everyone else, he was afraid she would think that he had a screw loose. She accepted what the brothers had told her, and then she moved on with her life. "Have you ever had one come close?" asked my granddaddy. "No, there's a distance they keep, and they never get any closer." Uncle John seemed at peace with these things. I think, and I'm just guessing, that he enjoyed these things that lived on the family land, and they were peaceful and had never been a threat to anyone. Well, after that night, there were many discussions on the back porch after they had finished supper. Sometimes grandmother would sit out there with them and listen, and the more she heard, the more she became interested. Granddaddy told them of as many times as he could remember that he had seen them, and he went as far as saying that the more time passed, the more the animals would trust Uncle John, and if it was anything like he had experienced, they would come closer. And day after day, the men worked the farm, and Uncle John cleared a good section of brush. The leaves had turned and were falling from the trees, and the men were not wearing jackets yet, but it wouldn't be long. Whatever they grew had been harvested, so now the only chores they had were maintaining the few pieces of farm equipment and taking care of the cows that they raised, and this would go on all winter until spring broke and they planted again. Uncle John had cleared most of the brush by this time. Granddaddy, without much to do, started helping him gather the brush that had been cut, and they started building burn piles. They would stop a couple of hours before dark and stand at the edge of the woods trying to see these animals. And there were times where the animals would come close enough that they could see them, and they would assemble in a ragged order and look at the men. And Granddaddy said that once Uncle John raised his hand to wave at them, and it scared them, and they ran back into the woods. But they would be back the next day, and in all this time Uncle John would throw apple cores from his dinner pail, and the young ones would come close and grab it. And after that, he would bring an extra apple, and he'd cut it in halves or quarters and throw it into the woods to watch the young ones come close. Granddaddy said that these creatures gave Uncle John peace. A front had come through, and it had rained for a full day, and the temperature dropped several degrees. With the dry brush now damp, it was time to burn the piles of trash. And Granddaddy was not there that day when Uncle John lit the fires, so he didn't see what happened. But as the fires burned and smoked, the woods animals came all the way in, almost into the field, to watch the piles of brush burn. It was early November, and Uncle John had been in this field for a few months, and he knew by sight all the animals and their young. He never saw any males and assumed that they were more shy than the females, or they were out gathering stores for the winter. We'll never know, but he thought it was odd that no males ever showed themselves. Toward dark, John heard something he had never heard just inside the woods. His curiosity overcame him, and he walked into the trees, and he found a female squatted, holding on to a tree and giving birth. Well, that settled it about the males. She wouldn't be able to have a baby without a male's contribution. He watched the baby slide out into the leaves, and 2 other females came in beside the mother and picked the baby up, and they shook it, and he assumed it was to get it breathing, and they helped the mother down onto her back so that she could rest. John was surprised to see this mother still in pain after all that, because she was pushing, and he thought he'd see another baby appear. But then a large mass exited the female, and that wasn't a baby creature. We know now that that was the afterbirth that she needed to expel, but at the time, he thought this mother was dying, and so he moved closer. Another female stood up between him and the female, and he knew he needed to back away, and that's what he did. And eventually, the mother got up and took the baby, who wasn't crying like a human child. It was just making noises, and they headed into the dark woods. The odor of blood filled the air, and he could smell it all the way into the field, and he thought about bears and wildcats, and that mass would probably be gone by the next day, and he walked to gather his tools. A scream came from the woods, and there was a commotion, and then more screams from other animals. John returned to the edge of the trees, and he could see that a big male had come into the group. It was dark enough that he only saw shadows, but from the sounds and the violence he heard, there was no doubt that a male had come in. I remember my granddaddy telling me this whole story. I sat across from Granddaddy's chair, and a dark mood swept into the room when he stopped telling me the story at this point. Minutes passed, and I thought he had had a stroke because he stared out of the window and he didn't even twitch. I wanted to ask if he was all right, but I had a feeling that he was reflecting on what he was about to tell me, so I sat in silence with him. Finally, he raised himself out of the chair and he went into the kitchen, and he came back with a glass of water for both of us. But he drank most of it. I think his mouth was dry. "What did you all do at that point, Granddaddy?" I asked. The silence was making me uncomfortable, so I had to say something. So he took a deep breath and he sat back in his chair and he told me the rest of the story. He said, "My brother was not a big man, but he was strong, even with his back broken like it was. He had a temper, though. Growing up, we had to fight. It was just a way of life up here in these mountains. John never backed down from any fight. I think he liked it a little, even when he was whipped. When he moved off to Texas, something must have changed him. Maybe it was the war. Maybe he just grew up like the rest of us, but he had become a gentle soul. While his back was mending and he sat out on that porch, he'd feed hummingbirds from his hand. He'd fill his hand with sugar from the kitchen and cup his hand and put water in it and hold it out when there was a bird near, and it wouldn't be long before the tiny birds were lighting on his thumb and drinking. He even fed squirrels and chipmunks that lived behind the house. Those rodents would sit in his lap and eat seeds and nuts. Your grandmother would get frustrated with John for taking dinner scraps in a napkin and throwing them out for animals. And while he worked in the fields clearing the brush for me, that field was full of cows, and that's where we kept them. And one day my big old bull broke in there to get to a heifer that was in heat. I had never been able to get close to that bull, and neither had anyone that I knew, but John made friends with him. I walked out there one evening to call him in for supper, and that big bull and John stood in that field, and John just a-scratching that bull's neck. And that big old bull followed John around. It was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Well, what I'm saying is that he had a way of making animals trust him. He was patient, I suppose because he had a lot of time on his hands while he was hurt. He wasn't that way when we grew up, but it was really something to see. But on the day he saw that baby creature born and that male come in, something changed. Granddaddy stopped again, but only for a minute, and then he finished the story. My Uncle John was walking away from the woods that evening. I think in his mind there was nothing he could do about that mean old male creature that was raising havoc among the females. It was the way things were in nature, and who was he to interfere? But a cry from a mother made him turn around and walk back into the trees. Uncle John must have seen something terrifying or horrific. Granddaddy says that big male must have been a stranger to this bunch of creatures, because there's no way he was a daddy or one of the daddies to these young ones, because just like a lion will do in Africa, to kill all the cubs in a pride that aren't its bloodline, that male was walking through and killing all the young creatures. John watched him chase down and snatch up a few, and he'd crack their necks and he'd toss them to the ground. But when John watched him catch up to the new mother holding that small newborn and kill that baby, John couldn't take it anymore. He walked back to the field and he grabbed that long-handled Kaiser blade that he had used for weeks chopping brush, and he turned back into the woods. Now, we don't know what happened in those woods because no one was there to see it. Granddaddy and Grandmother had sat down to eat and were waiting for John to join them after work. It was not unusual that he would be a few minutes late. Granddaddy had walked out into the field with the light thinking John may have been hurt and couldn't get back to the house. But instead he found his brother sitting by the barn with that bull standing next to him, licking the back of John's head. "John, you okay there?" Granddaddy said. "Yeah, I'm okay." "Are you hurt?" And in the dull light, Granddaddy could see blood on John's hands and clothes. It looked like he'd been slaughtering a pig and hadn't stood back when he bled him out. "I said I'm all right. I'll be to the house in a bit," John said. "John, walk that bull into the barn and lock him up so I can come in there and check on you." Well, John stood, and that bull followed him into the main stall, and John came out of the wire fence, and he was covered in blood, and now Granddaddy could see him in the good light. "What in the world happened, John?" Granddaddy said. "I'll show you in the morning. It's too dark to see now. I had to kill one of those hairy animals. I had to, Jesse. I had to." Well, Granddaddy didn't ask questions, and they walked back to the house. And John used the wash pail on the porch to clean the blood away, and he stripped down to his underclothes and went to his room, and he never spoke to anyone, and they didn't see him until breakfast the next day. With the new light, John walked his brother into the thick patch of woods, and Granddaddy said he'd never seen anything like it. Scattered about were several young creatures, dead in misshapen forms. One female mother was dead, holding her little newborn baby. They walked further and found an enormous creature with several wounds laying dead in the leaves. Rain started to fall, and they both bundled their collars up to their ears in the cool mountain air. "I've never seen one this close," Granddaddy said to John. In all the years he had been seeing these things, he had never gotten close enough to know what they really looked like. "I hadn't either until last night. They almost look like people, don't they?" said John. "Why'd you kill all these creatures?" asked Granddaddy. "I only killed him," said John. He pointed at the big one laying on the ground. "He killed the babies, and I couldn't let him keep killing them." "I understand," said Granddaddy. I think Granddaddy must have put his hand on John's back or something to let him know that he did believe him. "We need to do something with these things," said John. "They'll be stinking in a day or so." "Well, my horse is lame right now. We don't have a way to move this big one. Let's let the scavengers take him. Should be cool enough to keep the smell down." And they started back out of the woods, and John had the Kaiser blade over his shoulder after picking it up from where he dropped it. A brief noise behind them made them turn and look, and a few of the creatures stood barely in view in the woods. And that was the first time John ever saw males in the group. Granddaddy and Uncle John watched from a distance as the group gathered the dead from their clan and disappeared back into the forest. "You killed that monster with that Kaiser blade?" Granddaddy said as they walked. "It's all I had," said John. "And I keep wondering where the males were. Where were they, Jesse?" Thanksgiving came and went, and the days got colder. There was not much work to do other than feeding the animals, and Uncle John and Granddaddy and some of the brothers hunted and took a few deer. John would see ghostly shadows just at dark at the edge of the woods now and then, and they always came for the deer scraps after one had been dressed and butchered, but he never got close to them again. Christmas Day was nice with the whole family gathering at Granddaddy and Grandmother's house. We drove from North Carolina that year. I don't remember it because I was so young, but Granddaddy says I talked gibberish to Uncle John for a long time while he held me in his lap. I wish I could remember this man, but so much information leaves us as we grow old. We spent several Christmases at Granddaddy and Grandmother's place, and I remember some of those, but John was not there. On New Year's Day, John packed his car. Granddaddy said he headed back to Texas. He said that one or two of the brothers and his sister came to see him off, and he left that day and they never saw Uncle John again. He went back to Texas and he never came back, and that is the way things were in those days. Now, Grandmother died more than 30 years ago, and 2 years after that, Granddaddy came to live with us. And this is when he told me this story. Now, Granddaddy read books all the time, book after book, sitting in that chair that we'd brought from his house. We had great conversations when I'd go to Mom and Daddy's to see him. His mind was sound, and he could hear good, and he could talk in coherent sentences just like anyone else. He wasn't crazy. It's pretty good for a man his age. I believe his story about Uncle John. He had no reason to make something like that up at his age. He never used the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He just called them animals or creatures. He said those things didn't have a name that he knew of. Eventually, Granddaddy would succumb to slight dementia in the last years of his life. And when he left the house one day and walked 2 miles in his drawers looking for Grandmother, my parents figured it would be better if he were in a nursing home. Well, he didn't object, and his family members that lived near us were with him when he died. He was a good man, and he lived a good life. As of today, this is all I know about my Granddaddy's brother, John, other than what you've read in this story. I know that he never married, and I know he had no children. I guess he built a life in Texas that he liked, and that's where he stayed. Now I'm old, and my husband and I don't travel anymore. We were in Texas several years ago, and we thought about going to see Uncle John's grave, but it was hours out of our way, and we agreed that we would look for it the next time we were back down that way. But we never did go back to Texas. And if I could, I would make a special trip to Texas and leave some flowers. A grave should be visited by family. I doubt that anyone visits Uncle John's grave, though, and I don't suppose there's anything that anyone can do about that. The land that my Granddaddy inherited from his family stayed in our family for many years. And each time a generation would die off, the land would be equally divided among the heirs. And at some point, the parcels got so small that the family decided to sell it all in one shot, and that's what we did. And I have wonderful memories of Granddaddy's farm. I never knew about the animals that lived there while my husband and I owned a small piece of it. Our family sold the land before Granddaddy ever told me this story, and I have no access or permission to go see if the creatures still live there. And I wonder how many generations of Tennessee Sasquatch have been born since my Uncle John saved that clan. I doubt anyone will ever know.